Okay, Patrick just told me to go ahead. Everyone else can hear Patrick, but for some reason I can't. So Patrick just told me to go ahead and get started, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. So Patrick may have introduced me. My name is Matt Provencher. I'm the Western Washington Stewardship Forester. He was telling me privately here that there's a fair amount of you from Eastern Washington on this talk. So I have Rob Lionberger, my Eastern Washington counterpart, contact information up there on the screen for you. Um, my my talk is mostly going to be focusing on Western Washington issues. However, some of it will be valid in Eastern Washington, and I'll try to make a comment or two about Eastern Washington as I go. But you'll get much more detailed, in-depth information if you have any particular questions by talking to Rob there. So today we're going to talk mostly about vegetation management and a little bit of slash management, both pre-planting and then a little bit of post-planting as well. So what we're going to cover, like I said, some pre-planting site prep. Pre-planting site prep includes both vegetation management, but also some slash management. Post-planting vegetation management, we're going to talk about that as well. And that's basically after you've planted trees, but you still have vegetation issues, what do we do then? So let's talk about vegetation management, site prep and release, right? Site prep, pre-planting, release, post-planting. What's its importance? Why do we want to do it? Why do we want to control competing vegetation? The first few years of a tree's life historically are some of the hardest. Those first 2 years, once the trees are in the ground, they're under a lot of stress. Historically though, 90+% of the trees would probably survive. We used to have historically very good survival, at least in Western Washington. In Eastern Washington, survival was never 90%. It was always considerably less than that. But as things are getting warmer and drier over here in Western Washington, what we've seen over the last few years is a trend where that level of survival really can't be expected anymore. Sometimes we're getting 50% survival, sometimes it's a little bit more, but it's quite a bit less than what we've seen historically. So remember that prep begins before planting, and quite frankly you should be thinking about it before you're even harvesting timber, looking around, seeing the type of vegetation that's coming up, knowing what you may be up against after you've cleared the site and brush has the ability to start going. And remember again that this means not only controlling competing vegetation, but also managing the downwood and the logging slash. The term vegetation management is all inclusive. So remember that: site prep prior to planting, release after planting. And it's all about ensuring the resources on the site, the light, the water, the nutrients are available for your desired vegetation and not for your undesired vegetation. And this is especially true when we're talking about invasive weeds. Invasive weeds really crowd out native plants, and we're not just talking about trees there. We're talking about native brush vegetation as well due to their aggressive nature. They really reduce habitat value for wildlife, birds, fish, insects. Yeah, some of them have a little bit of wildlife value, but in almost all instances, a native plant community will have much greater wildlife value than any monoculture of invasive species that you may have out there. They reduce tree health and vigor, they reduce tree growth, they reduce timber value or the length of time it takes to grow large trees if you're trying to get to an old growth or a complex forest condition. They can slow or eliminate the establishment of forest regeneration, and we're going to see pictures of that today. And they cost a lot of money. I mean, it's estimated that Scotch broom alone costs about 150 or 140 million dollars to the Washington economy. So they cost you a lot of time and a lot of money. So the question comes up, isn't brush good for the forest? Well, yeah, sure. Brush is great for a forest. It's not about having no brush or no shrub competition, but just about controlling what occurs, when it occurs, and where it occurs. So think of it, if you're going to take the time to plant some trees, that takes a lot of your time, a lot of your effort, a lot of your money. And when you want to do it, you want to make sure to protect your investment by making sure that the trees you've planted are going to be successful. And after we've ensured survival, or at least the best that we can ensure survival, then we can allow or introduce a forest understory, trying to control those invasives as much as possible. So again, site prep, pre-planting, we're going to talk about a couple of different ways to do it: mechanical, chemical, hand pulling, or slashing. We're not going to talk about burning too much. You can see that bottom right picture there. That's a slash pile being burned. In Western Washington, this happens all the time, but isn't necessarily a necessity. You don't have to do it. For those of you in Eastern Washington, this is probably something you want to consider a little bit more after timber harvest, because it's a little bit more important to control the amount of slash on the site there by removing the slash, either through burning, chipping, whatever, in Eastern Washington than it is in Western Washington, mostly due to historic forest ecology as well as fire hazards. So site prep, we're first going to talk about some slash management before we go into vegetation management. So the purpose of slash management: creating plantable spots. This pick here that we're looking at could probably use a little bit of site prep. You look kind of down here in this corner where my mouse is, you can see some green vegetation comes up. That's telling you that, yeah, you probably have a little bit of soil showing, right? So plantable spots, you need to plant them in bare dirt. And we have a little bit of areas there for that, but really with the slash loading there, we've probably increased our fire hazards substantially. It's going to be difficult to find the number of plantable spots that we have. So we really want to do something to arrange this slash. You can pile it and burn it in Western Washington and Eastern Washington. Maybe definitely more important to do in Eastern Washington. In Western Washington, entirely appropriate if you want to manage it that way, but we can manage it in other ways just through how we arrange things. So this is a photo of some slash that was mechanically arranged. This is an area where they really couldn't burn because of population centers in the area. So what did they do? So they mechanically arranged it and they created small piles. And so they left light to moderate slash throughout the entire landscape. Slash in general, and especially in Western Washington, is really good to leave. As it decomposes, it adds nutrients to the soil, which is really helpful as we're trying to grow a new forest. It provides shade to the soil to help moderate those soil temperatures so that they stay lower. And conversely, they raise soil moisture because they're shading and keeping that soil temperature a little bit lower. And all those things are really good for a forested environment. Even in Eastern Washington, that stuff is important, trying to maintain that soil temperature a little bit lower and the soil moisture a little bit higher. You just want to make sure you're doing it properly with the right type of slash to not increase your fire load that much. In Western Washington, things tend to decompose rather rapidly. In Eastern Washington, that's not the case. So when we leave a lot of fine slash in Western Washington, it goes away. In Eastern Washington, you could be potentially increasing your fire hazard if you leave a lot of that around. So along with what they've done here with the light to moderate slash, we've got some plantable spots, and then we have some small brush piles, right? So what they did, instead of creating a bunch of large brush piles that they knew they couldn't burn, they just put a couple of small ones all over the place. So you didn't lose that many plantable spots, and you were still able to move the slash around to make sure that you provided the benefits of slash while also being able to plant some trees. And keep in mind that you can do it poorly, right? So here's an example of some poor slash management. That dozer went all over the place around here, pushing slash around, basically removing any vegetation and any slash from the landscape. If you look at the burn piles to the left and right of that dozer, you can see how pink that soil is. That means that those piles were huge and burned too hot and too rapidly, and that really scorched the soil so that it's going to be very difficult for water to penetrate through not only those areas but the rest of the area in general, just because of the sheer amount of compaction from that machine going all over the place. They're probably going to have runoff issues with this now. They're probably lower the site productivity of this area a little bit. So this is what I would say is an example of too much of a good thing. Yeah, it's great to do some slash management, but we want to leave some slash on the landscape. We want to not compact the area too much so that we leave the same or improve our productivity. And that's not what happened here. This is great for condos or maybe some pasture land. This isn't a really good example of forest management right here. So moving away from some slash site prep and going into vegetation site prep, We'll talk about some mechanical site prep first. And when I say a mechanical, this is kind of what I'm talking about, some sort of machine. This is a skid steer with basically a brush mower attachment on the front. You can see the sheer amount of blackberries that it's going through. And basically all they're doing is basically a big lawnmower on the front, and they are just going through and mowing that stuff down. Um, that can be really effective in areas like this when you know you don't have trees. If there were some trees in there you're trying to protect, this can get difficult, and we'll talk about that as we move on a little bit more. So when I talk about mechanical site prep, this is the type of stuff I'm talking about, some sort of machine really to reduce the amount of vegetation on the landscape there. So we'll talk about chemical site prep. Basically, if you're going to decide to use chemicals, remember that the label is the law. So whatever chemical you decide to use, um, make sure you read and understand that label and you're using it appropriately, because it is the law. And I want to note that there's differences in intensity in how chemicals are applied. I know chemicals tend to elicit some intense reactions from people, quite often negative. So I'm not saying you have to use them, but it's a tool in a toolbox. And I do want to note the differences in intensity. So here's a picture of a helicopter spraying some chemical. Um, this is a photo that probably does elicit some negative reactions. Here's another photo of a crew walking on the ground, spraying chemical on bare dirt. This is what's called a pre-emergent, where that chemical is going to inhibit plant growth so that when you plant the trees, they're going to have the ability to have all the light, water, and nutrients on the site. So you can see that's a little less intense and a little less impactful than maybe that helicopter spraying the chemical. And then you have all these different methods of very targeted chemical application where you're going after the specific plant that you're going after, right? So you have the sponge over there on the left where you're dabbing on the bark of a plant, or a tree that you've cut and you're spraying chemical on the live outer portion of the tree, or you've done the hack and squirt method, like the guy with the hatchet there spraying into the hatchet marks. So very targeted applications. Um, Remember that these are a tool in the toolbox, and you don't have to use them. And I realize they often get bad press, but I do want to say that the vast majority of the science speaks to the safety of the chemicals that we use, especially in forestry. The forestry chemicals tend to be a little bit more benign than a lot of the other agricultural chemicals that you've heard about maybe. Um, Almost to an organization, land trusts and conservation organizations use them frequently in their restoration activities, especially when they're dealing with invasive species. Invasive species really cause some immense environmental damage. It may not look it because you're looking at vegetation, but it is far worse than the forest chemicals that we use. And conservation organizations and land trusts have even recognized this, and they use them very regularly when they're dealing with restoration activities. Other methods can be effective, but remember they're a little bit more labor intensive. But regardless, all I want to say is if you don't want to use chemicals, don't use them, right? But there may be some instances where it's appropriate, especially if you're dealing with invasive species. And we've already talked about mechanical means, and coming up here, we'll talk a little bit about some hand methods. So some other methods that you can use to control the vegetation if you don't want to use these chemicals. So here's some examples of how some of this chemical site prep can look on a site. So this is over in Mason County. This is a couple of years post-harvest. All that yellow you see in the background is Scotch broom, and you can see it's relatively little. You get some grass coming up, but the trees in general seem to be doing okay. They're a little browsed, especially the ones in the foreground there. But in general, they seem to be doing okay. Here's another example. This was first growing season after a chemical treatment. So you got a couple of ferns coming up with the trees, but for the most part, the trees have all the light, water, and nutrients available on this site for themselves, so that they've been given a really good head start. Um, this is after a fire. So this is in Western Washington. This was a fire near a pipeline or a power line. You can see a little tree down here in the foreground. A lot of these little sticks right up over here are actually Scotch broom. There's a ton of Scotch broom behind me in this picture here where the power line right away was, a ton of Scotch broom in that. And you can see there's very little to no Scotch broom coming up. And that was because of a chemical application they applied to give their baby trees, like this one here, another one right there. You can see as much as a head start as possible. Kind of another picture of the same fire. Again, in the foreground here, you can see these are old Scotch broom sticks that burned up in this fire. And you can see no Scotch broom coming up, despite the fact behind me again is that power line with a whole bunch of Scotch broom in it. And this is across the street from the first picture I showed you, where they didn't do any site prep. And you can kind of see in the back along some of the larger trees there, yeah, maybe it was a little bit more shady. You get some of the Douglas fir to establish, but over the whole rest of the property, it was really nothing but Scotch broom that took over. The Scotch broom became real aggressive in this area, and it really just took over the site and eliminated any of the seedlings that were planted in this area. This is down in Thurston County. The landowner here wanted to take advantage of some cedar regeneration that they had already in place when they harvested. So they harvested and did not replant, hoping that the cedar that was on site would respond, or that some of the bigger cedars in the area would throw out seed and that they would get some natural regeneration. And it didn't occur. What did occur is a bunch of grasses, Scotch broom, and blackberries. And this is 6 years after that harvest, and they still don't have any trees coming up on that, right? So the only thing we can do at this point is go back to site prep, probably mechanically at this point, because the stuff is too big for chemicals and is probably too much for hand pulling, and get ready to plant the site again. This is up in Clallam County, and this is an example where there's a little bit fewer invasives, but still a problem with vegetation for tree planting. So we have native sword ferns here. We get trailing blackberry, some elderberry, got some vine and big leaf maple in the area here, some grasses coming up, but no trees coming up. Everywhere we looked, there were no trees in this area. And so this vegetation really came up and choked out a lot of that vegetation that was growing there. So even native vegetation can be a problem. Less of a problem than the invasive vegetation, because at the very least, this is native. But if your goal was to have a forest and not a native brush patch, this is still a problem for you. Here's an example of a fire, again, in Western Washington, with no site prep underneath. And you can see under those trees that have all died, there's really nothing but Scotch broom, except for one little area right there of alder that kind of popped up. So we did get a little bit of native vegetation that was able to get up above that Scotch broom. But for the most part, the Scotch broom really took over the site after this fire in here. So what the last thing about site prep is hand pulling or slashing. A couple of different methods that you can use. If you don't want to use chemicals, you don't have brush hog, right? Those can be expensive to rent or buy depending on what you want to do. So this is where the good old fashioned elbow grease comes in handy. The two methods that I'm showing you right here, that weed wrench up in the top right, that can be really good for pulling Scotch broom. Down there in the bottom left, that's a brush saw. So that's basically a weed whacker with a circular saw attached to it as opposed to string. And that guy's sitting there going to town on the blackberries there. So this is really labor intensive, and this can take quite a bit of time. But again, if you don't want to use chemicals and you don't have the ability to get, a skid steer or the brush attachment like what I've shown you before, this might be an effective method for you. If you have a lot of acres, it's certainly going to be difficult, this method. You might need to get some help, buy some beer for some friends or something like that. If you're talking about a relatively small area, this can be a really effective method. It's a little bit easier to control once you get a handle on it to begin with. Some tips for pulling: try to pull it when it's small and young before the root systems have developed. Obviously, if you've bought into something like this, you bought property with already established Scotch broom or blackberries, a little bit harder to do that, right? But try to do that if you can. It's always easier to stay ahead of these problems as opposed to trying to catch up with these problems. Limit the soil disturbance so you don't create receptive seed beds. Follow up with the additional work as you need. And you can use barriers, especially if you have a small area. People have used cardboard before, or black plastic or geotextiles to try to shade out plants prior to planting. This can work great, especially if you're dealing with some grasses. A little bit harder, obviously, if you have established blackberries or Scotch broom, because it's hard to keep the sun out. And all it takes is a little bit of light in there to keep that stuff really growing. So that was all site prep or vegetation slash management prior to planting. So now we're going to talk about vegetation management after tree planting. This is what you've done after you planted trees and the vegetation competition has either started to come up or maybe even gotten out of hand. Remember, just like I've talked about, it's all about capturing the resources on the site or the growing space for your desired crop trees, and not for the undesirable vegetation. And remember, you've planted the trees. We've already talked about it. Lots of time, lots of money, lots of effort involved with that. And we want to try to protect that investment. Of what your objectives are, whether it's that timber money or whether it's older, more complex trees, earlier thinnings for some periodic income, reducing the tree mortality. And then we'll talk as we go into this for the last couple of minutes here about whether you're going to release trees you already have or whether you need to alter your objectives. So let's look at these two pictures here. The one on the left, a couple of years after harvest, is probably what most of us hope that we get. You get some really good trees with nice, strong, vigorous leader growth in there. Look at the slash, right? So the slash all over the place, but it's a minimal amount of slash so that they had plantable spots everywhere. You can see the small piles in the background, right? So they really did a good job with this, and the trees are looking really good. And then over here on the right, you can see there's a tree I have circled, and nothing but reed canary grass and blackberries, right? So the brush has really overtaken the site here. There's very few trees that we can at least see in there. The decision on what to do with that is tough from the picture. It would really depend on if we have trees we want to release or not. If this is the only tree, maybe we can get that brush hog or skid steer, you know, and go back in here and knock all this stuff out. But if you have quite a bit of these trees kind of throughout here poking their head out, that skid steer becomes really prohibitive, right? It's really difficult to do that. And then you're stuck even having to use chemicals or hand methods to get in there. Um, so why release? So here's some graphs from Oregon State University showing the growth of seedlings related to brush. So with no release, you can see the brush keeps growing and the seedlings kind of get to a certain point and then start to decline. That's indicating mortality in your seedlings. With the release treatment, you can see the brush declines and the seedlings keep on growing. And note that the brush doesn't go down to zero, right? Remember, I said the goal here isn't necessarily to eliminate brush, to have no brush. It's just to control it so that the seedlings can compete with it. And once we've done that, we can ensure the survival of our seedlings. So talking about releasing or altering objectives. So looking at these two pictures, the one on the left, I have a Douglas fir circled in there. And if you look closely in that picture, you can see there's a couple of others kind of poking around in there. But look at the vigor of that tree. So the branches are kind of pointing downward. Not a whole lot of needles on it. Not a lot of leader growth. It's kind of tall and skinny. So maybe its form is getting a little out of whack. If you were to cut these alders because you wanted to release these Douglas firs, it is not likely that those Douglas firs would respond to that release. So you may end up with no trees at all. So that picture on the left is an example of maybe we have to alter our objectives in that case and, start managing for alder. On the right there, I had that circled Douglas fir. It's got a pretty strong leader. The branches are pointed upward. The crown looks pretty vigorous. I know it's pretty hard to see, but maybe if we were to slash that alder and that competing vegetation in there, maybe that Douglas fir and other ones in the area might be able to respond and do very well. If you're gonna slash alder, timing is important. So we limit the resprouting. June or July is best. You get darn near 100% mortality, about 95, 96%. May's okay. You get the high 80s for mortality. August is okay-ish. You get about 70% mortality. Any other time of the year, it's pretty poor mortality. You get a lot of sprouting. By the time September comes along, you're only getting about 22% mortality. So really try to target June, July, maybe May with your alder slashing if you're looking to release any trees you've planted, and you'll do better. Um, Last couple of slides here. So the decision whether you want to let it go or start over. That's a tough decision. It's going to depend a lot on your goals and objectives for your property. If you look at this top left or bottom right pictures here, maybe even this middle picture, you're not seeing a whole lot of trees, right? Lots of Scotch broom, lots of grasses. Maybe you don't have a lot to work with here, and maybe it's best to come in and spray this with chemicals or rent that brush hog and come through here and get it taken care of and get it prepped for some good tree planting. This top left and this bottom right picture, maybe you have a few more options depending on your goals or objectives. If you have a timber management objective, neither one of those pictures have a lot of good quality timber or are likely to grow good quality timber. So maybe that means you start over. If you have a wildlife or aesthetic objective, non-revenue objectives, which a lot of small forest landowners have, maybe you can live with that. And maybe what we do is recreate some gaps to plant some conifers to kind of jumpstart succession to get the next group of trees in there. Or maybe we just let this go and let nature take its course, right? So really it's going to kind of depend on your goals and objectives and what we might do here. So last slide here, try to anticipate your challenges up front, know what's on your site, know what's going to grow. Remember that you can't just walk away after the trees have been planted, and be honest and realistic about your capabilities. It's a lot of work to manage property. And with that, there's that contact information, and I am done. And it doesn't look like I can still hear you still, Patrick. So
Can you hear me, Matt?
I can hear you now.
Okay. Wow, that was weird. Well, thank you though. Are there any questions for Matt? I know we're up on 12:30, but Matt, if you're able to stick around for a little while, if there's questions.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. It doesn't look like there was any so
No, I
far.
didn't see any questions come in yet, but I'm certainly willing to take questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, and as you can see, you got Matt's information there as well as Rob Lineberger's. You also have my information. You can always reach out to us outside of these webinars. We're happy to chat with you on phone or email or whatever's best for you. Yeah, it looks like there's not any questions. So, got one from Steve here. For chemicals, what do you recommend? Roundup or others?
Yeah, so really that's going to depend on what you have on the site, right? So Roundup is what we call broad spectrum. In other words, you spray it on something, it's going to kill it, right? So if you have trees that you're looking to save, there are other chemicals that affect broadleaves, but not necessarily needle-leaved vegetation. So you definitely want to know what you are trying to kill, and then that'll help you figure out what would be most effective. The easiest thing to do is to talk to your local dealer on chemicals, and they can help you make that decision, right? There's a lot of forest specific chemicals. Crossbow is one that comes to mind. Oust is another one that comes to mind. Roundup will certainly work if you're just looking to kill everything so that you can get trees in the ground. But there's other chemicals that might be useful to you as well. So I would talk to your local chemical dealer about that. Craig had a question about masticators. I see, Patrick.
Sure. Just real quick though, another resource would be your local county noxious weed board.
Oh, yeah. Good
This,
point. Those guys know everything
yeah.
about noxious weeds. I mean, it's really amazing. So especially if you're talking about invasive weeds, those guys know all the tricks to kill that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. So, question: what about a masquerader?
So a masticator, and you
Yeah.
see them around
Yep.
fires a lot. So basically that is really good for just going down and mowing down a lot of small vegetation, right? So in Eastern Washington, in areas where maybe the trees are too small for commercial thinning, or there's a lot of brush and maybe not a lot of trees to pre-commercial thin, or maybe even if they're going to do pre-commercial thinning, a masticator is basically this big head that just come and chew stuff up, right? In Eastern Washington, that's real important because, if you did the Western Washington pre-commercial thinning model and you just cut all the trees and left them lie, in Western Washington, you increase your fire hazard for about a year or two, and then that stuff really starts decomposing. In Eastern Washington, if you let that lie, it could be around for decades, and all that time, it's increasing your fire hazard. So what the masticator does is it basically chews it up into small pieces that can still decompose, and it limits your fire hazard. So if you're in Eastern Washington and you need a lot of vegetation management done, a masticator may be a good way to go for you. You don't see them too often in Western Washington. Um, but in Eastern Washington, it's definitely one of the tools out there for you. Um,
Great.
So you see Ken Bevis put his contact information up there. So he's DNR's wildlife biologist. So if you have any wildlife specific questions, Ken's always out there to help you out, right? And he's a great resource for you for not only your wildlife needs, but quite often your forestry needs as well.
We'll also be hearing from Ken on Friday, so you'll definitely want to tune in for that.
Yep. Does Roundup work on fresh cut blackberry stubs? I do it and it seems to work. I've never seen any research about that, but around my property, we have some patches of blackberries and some patches of Scotch broom, and I have seen little to no sprouting when I cut and then squirt some Roundup on. The book answer says you're supposed to use the concentrate, basically the 100% stuff with like a paintbrush or one of those foam brushes, and just dab it on there. I've used, the pre-bought mix stuff you get from Home Depot and sprayed it, and it still seems to work. So I think that can work really well. Although, like I said, that's just me seeing it work, and I'm not sure if I'm not sure if it really does work, but it seems to work in my property, anyways. Ooh, Scotch broom left unchecked for 100 years or more. So Scotch broom. I went to Scotch Broom Symposium like back in May or June. And I have to tell you, I'm amazed at just how terrible Scotch Broom is. They had these groups out there that were doing some prairie restoration. So, down there around Fort Lewis, the historical vegetation pre-Euro-American settlement was very few widely scattered trees, lots of grasses, and that was because of Native American burning. And so they've started to do that again, and they've been doing it for 30 or 40 years. And one of the guys that was talking about it showed this picture of Scotch broom on a site from 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And adjacent to it, there had been some burning already. And so Scotch broom had never colonized that site. 30 years later, even after they've removed the Scotch broom, they have not been able to get the same native plant community where the Scotch broom existed as the adjacent site where there was never Scotch broom. And so they really think that they already knew that Scotch broom is kind of allelopathic. In other words, it puts out a chemical when Scotch broom is living that kind of inhibits other plants from growing around it to give itself a competitive advantage. And Scotch broom certainly isn't the only plant that does that, but they knew it did that. What they found is that they think that Scotch broom alters the forest or alters the soil composition, so that it really long-term inhibits growth of native vegetation. And they've done studies in areas where they've removed the Scotch broom and then planted Douglas fir, and then planted Douglas fir in areas where there is no Scotch broom or never has been any Scotch broom. And though the Douglas fir grows, survival is always higher in areas where Scotch broom hasn't existed. So to kind of answer your question about how it looked unchecked over 100 years, certainly not the same as if you remove the Scotch broom now. What I would say is that Scotch broom is shade intolerant. So if taller vegetation like trees are able to get established over 100 years, the Scotch broom would die out because it can't survive in the shade. It's shade intolerant. The question really is, would trees get established under the Scotch broom? And a lot of these conservation organizations that ran that Scotch broom symposium really their answer is no. They don't think it really would get established, or would take a very long time to get established. So I hope that answers your question about what it would look like in 100 years from now. Look at Steve asking a question about raking our forest to keep competitors and fire risk down. So here's what I would say is that fire risk is more simple than one answer, right? So do we need to be managing our forests? We certainly do. And the reason why we need to be managing our forests is that we can't have prescribed fire everywhere, right? There's just some places where you can't put fire on the landscape. So you need to be able to manage those forests. However, you can't just look at managing forests. You have to look at land use patterns. Where are people building houses? Where are they allowed to build houses? You have to look at climate change and how that's affecting things, right? So there's all these other factors when it comes to our fire risk that politicians, on both sides of the aisle like to have, like, their talking point. We need to do this. And it's seldom that simple. And when it comes to forest management and fires, I would say the same thing. It is not as simple as let's just go out and do some forest management or rake the forest or whatever you want to call it. There's more to it than that. And you need to know about all of it. You need to deal with all of it in order to really move the needle.
Well said. Okay, well, I think that's all we've got. As I mentioned at the beginning, you do not have to re-register for tomorrow's session. I'll be sending out that information around, sometime between 10:30 and 11:30. So keep an eye out for that. Tomorrow we'll be back here with Matt to discuss actual tree planting, getting them in the ground. So thank you, Matt, and we will see you tomorrow.
All right. We'll talk to everyone tomorrow. Have a great day.